Jonah the big fish, the big smell and soggy rain. There was a man named Jonah who was a really nice guy. In his hometown, Jonahville, Jonah did his best to look after the people that he met and be nice to them. He was such a nice guy and he was voted nicest guy every year. Not very far from Jonahville was Ninehville. And every year the best football players from Jonahville and Ninehville had a match against each other. And every year, without fail, Jonahville lost. Badly. It didn't help that when they won, they would make fun of Jonah and his friends for being losers. And God didn't like the way the football team from Nineveh acted either. So God spoke to Jonah over some Jonahville scones. Now Jonah got very excited because he thought God must have noticed how many times he'd won the nicest guy award and badge. But then, rather suddenly, Jonah's smile turned upside down and a frown grew in its place. Because God wanted Jonah to go and tell the people of Nineveh that if they started playing nicely, he'd send them some really nice weather. Jonah didn't want anything nice to happen because they keep beating them at football. But being kind and loving is much more important, said God. Jonah really didn't want to do anything that makes the life of Nineveh better. So he went to the loo, climbed out the window where a taxi was waiting with its engine running and sped off. They eventually found themselves at a local seaside where Jonah found a fishing boat about to leave for several weeks of deep sea fishing. That'll do, thought Jonah as he jumped aboard. Now these fishermen were pretty tough and were used to the roughest of seas, but it wasn't long before the worst storm they'd ever known was throwing them a boat around, and they became very, very scared. In his cabin, Jonah was snoring happily away when the captain rushed in. Jonah woke up and immediately thought that something might be wrong. The worried look on the captain as he was getting thrown around the cabin by the giant waves was a pretty good sign that there was something wrong. "How can you sleep at a time like this?" he shouted at Jonah. Jonah was soon busy having second thoughts about his plan to save the people on the boat, but he climbed upstairs and a giant wave suddenly hit the fishing boat and threw Jonah overboard. Jonah's troubles were just beginning as an enormous fish appeared. Or, well, who knows? An enormous fish appeared, stared Jonah straight in the eye, and then in one big gulp gobbled Jonah whole. Jonah's smartphone battery didn't seem to like being dropped in the sea, so he couldn't even turn it on and use the built-in torch to find out what the horrible stench was and the stinky smell in the fish. Well, God asked the fish, called Bob, to leave Jonah on a nearby beach. Being a happy fish, Bob did one better. He threw up Jonah right on a bench where a taxi was waiting with its engine running. The taxi driver put a peg on her nose. Once she'd taken a sniff of her latest passenger, Jonah was just a tad stinky at this point. He'd been in the giant fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Brushing his hair, taking a deep breath, Jonah climbed out the taxi and started up the steps to Ninehville Palace. And it wasn't long before he was standing in front of the Ninehville chief. Jonah told him that God really didn't like the way that they were so naughty when they won their football match every year, because making fun of people, never a nice thing to do. He also said that if they didn't start being nice, God would send them British weather instead. Now, Chief Nigel didn't really fancy the idea of a soggy British rain over his town, or upsetting God, or making other people sad. So with the help of Jonah, Chief Nigel and all the people of Nineveh said sorry to God, and they set up a new football match the following weekend. After Jonahville had lost a game, they invited the Nineveh players for some tea and scones. To Jonah's horror, the football players from Nineveh started putting jam on their scones before putting on the cream. Jonah tried not to scream. How could they do that? He'd been nice to them against his better judgment, and they were ruining their scones. Everybody knows that cream goes on first and then jam. But he soon realised that enjoying the scones was probably more important than whether they got the jam and the cream in the right order or not. Before long the scones were all gone, the teapot had been drained of its very last drop of its finest tea, the karaoke machine had been turned on, and they all started singing together their favourite song. And it turned out it was the same song. Maybe the people of Nineville weren't too bad, thought Jonah, even if they did eat their scones all wrong.